Hello, everyone. A warm virtual welcome to all of you that have logged on. My name is Suda David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to this month's edition of Transatlantic Tuesday. Transatlantic Tuesday is a series that's been set up to discuss pertinent issues in the transatlantic relationship. We've covered issues such as Afghanistan, the German elections, and today we're going to talk about the results of the COP26 and how climate change is becoming an integral part of various countries' foreign policy agenda. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to go over the game plan for tonight. As usual, we'll have a short, moderated conversation for about 15 to 20 minutes. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box below, and the questions will queue up, and our moderator will get to them shortly. As I mentioned, we have a great lineup tonight. I'd like to start by introducing Sherri Goodman, who is a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Environmental Change and Security Program at the Polar Institute. She's also the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. Welcome, Sherri. We also have Connie Hedegaard, who is the former EU Commissioner for Climate Change and also the former Danish Minister for Climate and Energy. In addition, Connie Hedegaard is also an alumna of GMF's flagship program in leadership, the Marshall Memorial Fellowship. And for today's Transatlantic Tuesday, I'd like to hand the floor over to my colleague Laura, who's based in Brussels and spearheading GMF's work on climate policy. Laura, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suda. Thank you for introducing me, and it's a pleasure to be here today to discuss COP26 with a great lineup of speakers. Welcome everyone. As Suda said, please feel free as we speak to send in your questions through the Q&A function, and then we will get to them in about 15-20 minutes. So I would like to start with a question on COP26. The final text came late on Saturday night after 2 weeks of negotiations, and definitely amidst mixed reactions from delegates, civil society, and commentators. In relative terms, there have been progress made in Glasgow, but there are some that even go as far as saying that the summit has been a failure because in absolute terms, we are far from where we would like to be. I would like to know what Sherri and Connie take away from COP26. What are your main takeaways and comments, and how do we move from here? So Sherri, I'd like to start with you, and then Connie.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, and it's an honor to be here with Minister Hedegaard. I've known her terrific work and leadership over many years. I also want to pay a special recognition to the incoming president of the German Marshall Fund in the United States, Heather Conley, who is a friend and a colleague over many, many years, and who is just an excellent leader, super ripe for this time and for the organization. So to answer your question, Laura, where are we after the COP? Well, we saw the attention given globally to the urgency of climate action and to the fact that it's an existential crisis for so many communities, people, and countries around the world. That was abundantly clear. We also, unfortunately, and we did see some notable agreements on methane, on reducing deforestation, some action on climate finance, not quite what we would have wanted on coal, on phasing out coal, but watered down to somewhat to phasing down coal by India. So we see very clearly that domestic politics of the participant countries become a brake on widespread climate action. And that points directly to the challenge in sort of transforming our energy systems to meet the climate threat and transforming our economies. And we see the variability in the pace. Now, I think the good news is that the youth of the world, around the world, and those most affected, small island countries, in particular are really a voice for this era, and they are going to keep making their voice heard at louder and louder levels. I also think it's very clear from the COP that countries that still are heavily reliant on fossil energy also see the opportunity in terms of their presence to transform. Now, the question is, what's the pace? Because we're still well on track to reach above 1.5 degrees C, probably closer to 2 or beyond. The goal was to hold it below 2. What's the implications of that? I think, as an American, I know that I sometimes have tough conversations with people here in the United States, still about, okay, yeah, we get it, but all right, well, what does it really mean for me? And so I think we still have a lot more work to be done. A lot of good work was done that creates momentum for further investment and further action. I'm looking forward to the discussion about how we've integrated climate into foreign policy and national security, because there, I think the long-term trend is very positive and good news. But I'll save that for the second part of today's discussion.
Thank you. Connie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for having me, and very good to see you again, Sherri. And I agree with everything that has been said actually already. Already 1 week before Glasgow ended, we heard sort of the demonstrators say, oh, this is just, blah, blah, blah. But I think what people really need to understand is that these COPs, this international climate work, is a process. And yes, it is too slow. There is no discussion about that. It is too slow. We should do even more. But I must say that basically, I believe that Glasgow could have gone much worse. I think that there came new hooks into the text. And over the years, I've seen that, yes, it takes forever to get, for instance, coal mentioned. But when first it is in the text, then after some time, you also see that it starts to direct investments. It starts to guide companies, it starts to guide cities, municipalities, governments. So it actually means something when you get new words, concepts, ways of thinking into the text. I also think that what we saw in Glasgow was that what has been called the ambition mechanism from Paris. The fact that the countries every 5th year must look each other into the eyes and say, okay, can we do even more than we pledged 5 years ago? To a certain degree, it proved that it worked. Not perfectly, not everybody brought new things to the table, but a lot did. And a lot of the big players actually did. China not so much, to say it diplomatically. But I thought, for instance, that it was really interesting that India, for the first time, leaned forward in a context, coming up with the day where they want to be carbon neutral, but also saying that by 2030, half of all their electricity should be produced by renewables, renewable sources. I thought that was really interesting. And then I think that in the periphery, in the margins of the conference, some of the things that Sherri also mentioned, the CARS initiative, methane, forestry, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, the fossil fuel subsidies phased down, the Coal Alliance, many of these things, in my view, emphasized and showed to the world that, yes, it takes a long time in the negotiation rooms to move forward as much as we should, but action is really happening on the ground. Just a final point, I thought that it was really embarrassing that the developed countries could not deliver the $100 billion that they pledged back in Copenhagen in 2009. We have had 12 years to get our act together on this. And I think that creates a credibility issue. I think it's not very wise when it comes to soft power and the way that our nations are being perceived by a lot of developing countries. Actually, I'm positively surprised that it did not sour the atmosphere in Glasgow even more than it did, but I really would hope that we could get our act together and deliver what was promised in 2009 next year, because else I think that there is a major credibility issue.
Thanks, Connie. And I'd like to stay with you on that actually, as we move towards more of the climate, like the foreign policy aspect of climate action, and exactly on what you said, because, well, on one side, yes, we know that the process is a slow one. I mean, this is a global compromise, as the UN says. So it takes time. Also, countries move at different paces because of domestic constraints, as Sherri was saying, but also because of the nature of their economy and the state of their development. And I mean, you said in the past that the EU is a champion of its own people, but also of other people in other parts of the world. And I would like to know from you, how do you see these tensions addressed by the European Union between its own decarbonization process and the way that these influence other countries and the impact that it has on other countries, but also on European policies, or European external policies, so, you know, trade policies, but also specific measures like the carbon border adjustment mechanism and climate finance that you mentioned?
Well, just to say that basically during many years, also during the periods where, for instance, the Americans and different US administrations did not play too much ball, and also during the 4 years with President Trump, I mean, it is Europe who kept this process alive and took the leadership there and took care still to make alliances with a lot of developing countries, reached out still to China, for instance, assisting China in getting their emissions trading scheme right, and things like that. So I think that Europe has played a key role. And I also think that the fact that Europe was the first sort of major region to come up with real targets and pledges prior to the Paris Agreement, that was really, really important. So I think that many things have been done, but I do think that Europe could do much more when it comes to foreign policy and to mainstream and integrate climate priorities into its development policies, but also into its geostrategic approach. And there I think that sometimes it is a bit disappointing. I still recall when we, for instance, in 2012, 2013, worked on the aviation. I mean, what should we do with aviation and climate? Something needs to be done. You know, it is easy, relatively easy to say, we want this and that to happen. But then you need the whole diplomatic effort of the European countries to back up these policies. Then I think that we could still do even better and incorporate climate change policies much more consistently into the foreign policy and the geostrategic discussions. And that would also give leverage, I think, to Europe's soft power, for instance, with the African countries and other developing countries.
Thank you, Connie. I'd like to move to Sherri now to ask you about, well, integrating climate into security and defense, not just foreign policy. And you mentioned before you think that there are very positive developments going on. So we'd like to know more about that.
Thank you, Laura. So let me just put this in the context that in 2007, I organized the first group of military leaders to address the national security implications of climate change in the United States. And we released the report, Climate Change and the Threat of National Security, characterizing climate change as a threat multiplier. That was immediately integrated into discussions in the UN Security Council that were the first of its kind in April of 2007. And also at the same time, the US Congress adopted many of our recommendations, including that the national security implications of climate change be addressed in the President's National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, National Military Strategy, and something called the Quadrennial Defense Review, as well as the first National Intelligence Assessment of Climate Change. That laid the groundwork over the last 15 years for growing awareness and integration of climate security risks in foreign policy and particularly in national security policy. We now have, and I co-lead with the former Dutch Chief of Defense, an international military council on climate and security that has produced 2 world climate and security reports. And my counterpart was at COP addressing these issues. at the highest levels. So while that wasn't front and center of the main COP negotiations, I will say that in the US, for example, and I know this is true in other countries as well, in President Biden's executive orders on climate change, which came out the first week he was in office, had a substantial section on integrating climate into a whole range of foreign policy and national security policies. Many of those reports have just come out in the US in the last month or two, including climate adaptation plans from every federal agency, the first defense climate risk assessment, the first national intelligence estimate, which is a deeper, broader document on climate risks in an intelligence context. And so now I think we are much better prepared, both in the US, but also I'd say with our European allies, other allies around the world, to understand both climate risks as they apply within our security policy. And I'd say President Biden has integrated climate change into virtually every meeting he's had with a foreign leader, and the opportunities and the need to put this front and center in our foreign policy and national security decision-making. So I see that that is really happening, both to understand vulnerabilities. For example, what are Russia and China's climate vulnerabilities? What are the Americans' vulnerabilities? And Europe, we know some of them. And then second is, where can we lead? Where can we lead in the race to the top in clean energy? And that's where for example, some militaries, the US is a large energy user in the United States, have buying power. And as they transition, as they adopt more electric vehicles, buy better batteries, transition to sustainable aviation fuels, they can help make markets for more broader commercial adoption of these vital clean energy technologies.
Thanks, Sherri. And you mentioned China and Russia. You have said in the past that that unless we take into account climate change, the United States will not be able to produce an effective policy on China. I mean, in the context of COP26, the US and China created actually a working group to cooperate in the years to come on climate change. We'll see what comes out of that. But can you tell us more about in what ways you think climate should be considered as a factor in the US strategy towards China?
Yes, absolutely. And I think in three ways, and I put this in the context that during the Cold War, when we were locked in competition with the Soviet Union and feared a bolt out of the blue nuclear strike, that did not prevent us during the détente years from having arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union, or from developing confidence building measures so we would reduce the risk of a nuclear accident or a miscalculation. And I think we need some of the same types of approaches now in the climate era. We need to understand that first, that all countries around the world have faced climate vulnerabilities, China included, and we need to understand those from a strategic perspective. China is very dry in certain parts, very prone to flooding and sea level rise in other parts, and controls the headwaters of the major rivers of Asia. And that is also a deep concern, but also something we have to factor into our policies with other countries in the region. We also need to recognize that there are soft power elements of climate diplomacy as we engage, particularly in the Pacific, with highly climate vulnerable countries. The US is a Pacific power projecting force, across from its west coast into very climate vulnerable countries in the Pacific region, that China is also seeking to shore up its relationship. So we need to understand their needs and integrate that into our work with our allies and partners. And finally, we need to understand that there's a need for greater transparency in some of this, and climate science and data is an area where there may be possibilities despite the frostiness of the relationships, and a race to the top. Finally, of course, in clean energy, we should own those global markets and not cede them as we have in the past decade, certain sectors, for example, solar panel manufacturing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Connie, would you like to come in as well on this kind of how climate changes relationship with China from a European perspective, also from a transatlantic perspective?
Yeah, and from a transatlantic perspective, exactly. Again, I would agree very much. I think it is crucial now that NATO, after 4 years with Trump, where this was not a topic in NATO and could not be, that they are coming back now, really focusing on what Sherri rightly was mentioning as sort of climate change as a threat multiplier. I mean, we're talking about thawing permafrost, desertification, opening up of new shipping lanes, refugee, and a whole host of new challenges that really need to be addressed and be part of sort of the way we think security. And I think that it is high time that climate change is sort of a built-in part of the way we think security. Take what is happening right now in the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia. Look what is happening in Mali and the Western Africa. Look what we will see more of in the Middle East. I mean, it is climate change as a threat multiplier. It's not the only reason why we have crisis and instability and what's worse, but it is a threat multiplier. So I really think that we have to have much stronger strategies on how to work with this. On this US-China initiative that came up in Glasgow, obviously it is really, really good that the American administration has decided that despite all the challenges and disagreements with China, there should be one area, climate change, where the dialogue can continue and hopefully can be stronger. But as far as I'm informed, yesterday when Presidents Xi Jinping and President Biden had several hours long conversation, climate change was not the topic. So again, I think that we really have to make sure that when leaders meet at the strategic level, discussing the overall security issues and foreign policy issues, climate change has a place at top of the discussions here in these decades.
Yes, that is perceived as a priority. Another area that is a key region in the world when it comes to climate change, a very fragile one, is the Arctic. Sherri, you talked about this at COP26 at a backdoor event, I believe. What's your view about the geopolitical tensions, how they're developing in this region, and what are the climate implications of those?
Well, thank you, Laura. The great irony of climate change is that it is occurring to an even greater extent in the Arctic polar regions than the rest of the world, with temperatures rising 2 to 3 degrees, permafrost thawing and collapsing, and long-term sea ice retreating. That has created a whole new ocean in our lifetime that is increasingly navigable. And so now, for example, President Putin envisions a toll road for transit across Russia's northern sea route that stretches along its long Arctic coastline to connect ports in Asia to ports in Europe, and has set very aggressive shipping goals. It has remilitarized parts of the Arctic. China itself has polar ambitions, a polar Silk Road connecting its vast Belt and Road Initiative across parts of the Arctic, and is developing ice breaking and other capability. Even now, just a new heavy icebreaker has just been announced to help extract fossil fuels, liquid natural gas from the vast Russian energy complex at Yamal and elsewhere. So the irony is that there's a race on to extract that fossil energy from Russia and parts of the Arctic before perhaps it becomes stranded, as those assets are less in demand as we make the transition to clean energy. So that puts even greater stress in climate risk within the Arctic, which is also a tipping point, according to the IPCC. If the Greenland ice sheet melts at an even faster rate, could raise global sea level rise, or sea ice retreating, in fact, doubles the impact of climate risk by reflecting back through the dark water instead of having the white sea ice to protect those the sunlit rays. So we now see that we have to have an Arctic strategy. I will say that I'm very pleased that NATO, for example, has a very bold climate action plan. And this encompasses climate action across the NATO region, but includes the Arctic, and some members have been very active on addressing that, and that will enable NATO to address climate risk and respond appropriately in that region. And in conjunction with our other partners in the EU, has been stepping up its game as well. And I think that's equally important. So we need to understand we have to be prepared to operate in a more open Arctic, and that the near-term risks, I sometimes say what keeps me up at night is some accident or a miscalculation across as vessels are, we have limited communication in certain parts of the Arctic. With more presence comes more risk of an accident, a collision, a need for a search and rescue. And so we have to be prepared for that, while at the same time doing our best to understand the changing Arctic conditions through more science and research, and also acting to limit those risks by transitioning our global energy systems.
I mean, do you think that there are margins to think about an alliance or some kind of process that can prevent the Arctic, well, some activities to take place in the Arctic, especially some that you mentioned at the beginning, at the risk of losing some profits, but avoiding that the Arctic becomes a major supply chain route, for example, or that fossil fuel are continue to be extracted in the region? Do you think there is the possibility to imagine an alliance that prevents that from happening?
Well, I think we're always going to be walking and chewing gum. I mean, there is a long history of cooperation in the Arctic through the Arctic Council, which Russia chairs today, and there is reasonable cooperation among the Arctic participants, and I expect that to continue. At the same time, the Arctic Council is not a security organization, and so we may need more than that, and we need to be mindful. The Arctic is still a very treacherous place to operate, so it's not a substitute yet for transit through other global navigation routes. But we should be mindful that other countries have a long-term vision and are building capability today to be able to operate in that region as the ice does retreat. And right now, we're not on a track to avert that. In fact, each year brings warmer and warmer temperatures, less sea ice, and more permafrost collapse. And in the industrialized regions of the Russian Arctic, that permafrost collapse could be a great source of insecurity and risk of accident in future years.
And Laura, just a short one. It's probably no coincidence that China put a lot of emphasis on some years back becoming an observer status in the Arctic Council, where even the EU today is not an observer. So it just shows how much interest there is around it. There is one thing from Glasgow, though, on this that went almost unnoticed. Actually, Greenland. They signed up to this Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. I think that is worth noticing because, as was mentioned, there are so many reservoirs of oil up there around Greenland, but nonetheless, actually, although it has been their great hopes that the oil potential in the future should be what could make Greenland even more economic independent from Denmark, they actually signed up to not wanting to explore that. And I just want to mention it here because I think it's slightly surprising that nobody really noticed that Greenland signed up to this.
That's true. Yes, no, that's a very good sign. And actually, since you mentioned that, I mean, I find that this initiative very interesting because of the way that it was created, but also because of the kind of actors that joined with Quebec, for example, like subnational government joining the alliance, California as well as a low tier, I think, member, Italy as a friend. I'm not sure what this means, but we'll see. But all these countries are low producer of fossil fuel, with the exception of Greenland that you mentioned, and well, Italy is not really completely involved. So do you think there is potential for these to involve bigger producers, and what would be the way to bring them in?
Yeah, you're of course right that those 10 nations that signed up to this, they are not the big oil producers of this world. And nonetheless, Denmark has been almost self-reliant from oil and gas from the North Sea. So to decide, as the government and the broad majority in parliament decided earlier this year, to stop having new licenses there, it is not nothing. It was a real step, but you're right that the big ones have not signed up to this. But I would say I was in Norway last week when this discussion was on the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance really came up at Glasgow. And I can tell you, by following the discussion in Norway, a big oil and gas nation, just to have such an alliance, such an initiative, that sort of raises questions that civil society, that the NGOs, that policymakers in parliament start to ask to the government to say, when are you going to phase down? When are you going to phase out? Is there an end date? So I think that initiatives like these in itself send some signals to those who assess values in the fossil fuel industry, for instance, and those who decide where to invest and where not to invest. So in that sense, I think it has an impact.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I think the very existence of something like this shows that it can be done as well. Well, hopefully it will be done. So I will stop to abuse my power of moderator because we have a lot of questions. So we'll go through them now. So Connie, I think the first question we have is for you. So Megan Richards, who is a senior fellow, non-resident senior fellows with us, asks, in principle, both energy and climate diplomacy have been integrated into EU external policy and development assistance. But more could be done, as you mentioned before, Connie. What specific actions are suggested to further and improve these actions?
Well, I think what could be done is that in the council that they have at the EU level, climate could be even more integrated in the discussions. There have been some attempts to that, but it's not done in a very systematic manner. And I also do think that the whole EU system of missions, of delegations, that is the whole diplomatic core in the Foreign Action Service, could be, used, it could be exploited much more in a positive manner to the benefit of sort of highlighting what is the potential in working together in the climate field. That there is really a lot more that could be done. I think that there is a capacity there that is not being exploited nearly as much as it could. So there is a tendency that climate is still, that's the climate energy people in their silo. And then sometimes, yes, it pops up, but it's not sort of really mainstreamed into the whole external action service. And I think it could be that.
Thank you. Sherri, another question on China. A key question is that China is a system rival to the United States, I believe, and to what extent may be necessary to compromise with China on basic civil liberties in return for Chinese promise to take on more ambitious climate action. So basically, to what extent are we willing to negotiate on other fronts to make sure that we collaborate on climate? That's the question.
Well, I would say, yes, we do view China certainly as a challenge to the liberal world order, which the United States and our NATO and EU allies, the West and other Pacific allies, are committed to an open, free, democratic system, which China is not. And in that sense, it presents a challenge. Now, one could say the same about the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And in American foreign policy, I will say, we have often had our values, which we express, through human rights and civil liberties. We also have taken into account geostrategic and national interest heavily in determining foreign policy strategies, decisions, and outcomes. And, there's always a mix in that sausage. I don't think you're going to see the US directly compromise its opposition to the Uyghur genocide and other, other failures of human rights and civil liberties in China. At the same time, that in and of itself isn't going to mean that we're not going to take on encouraging China to take more ambitious climate action, particularly when we know it's going to be in its own national interest and when it serves our own interest as well. So again, I think in all of these things, you have to be able to walk and chew gum. You have to do both. You have to understand when to play each card. And that's why what we've been talking about is the climate literacy across various parts of the foreign policy and national security decision-making apparatus is so important. And I think that's where we're really seeing some system change now within our own governments, that it's not simply just the climate experts over here in their little silo, but it's all the regional experts. It's people who develop Asia Pacific policy and strategy in the US and in Europe. It's people working on NATO. It's across all regional and functional areas of specialty that this climate lens, as we say, must be applied. And that's what I think will enable us to make the right set of decisions and assess these risks in the right way.
Thanks. There's a question about what could we do at the G20 level? So how can we use that forum in a more assertive way? I think it's interesting because at the G20, right before COP26, the decision between the US and the UN still has potential big climate implications. But yes, what could we do more at the G20 level? Whoever of you would like to jump on this first.
I could start. I think that what the G20 actually adopted just before the Glasgow COP was really interesting, where they signed up to, all 20 signed up to not contributing to building coal outside their own national borders. And yes, there are many problems inside the borders, but actually that was a real step forward, I think. So to me, that's just one example of what G20 can actually do. I think in the years to come, to deliver on all these nice promises and pledges and targets on climate change, we need to sort of go through, sector by sector by sector. Laura, you mentioned earlier the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that was sort of come from an EU perspective with steel, with cement, with fertilizer, maybe, different sectors. How to be better at exchanging best practices, how to sort of maybe say when it comes to trucks, or when it comes to green steel, or that there are things that could be done at the G20 level. There's also things that could be done by expanding emissions pricing systems and schemes. They will have to be different, probably for as a bridging period at least. But I think to have these discussions among what is not just the biggest economies, it's also the biggest emitters. I think that their G20 could play an interesting role. And that is not to say that the developing countries should not still be there and the UNFCCC process and all this, but I think that the biggest emitters have a special responsibility. So if now we could start to work even more with them on phasing out, for instance, also phasing out subsidies to fossil fuels, phasing out coal, have the real discussions there, I think that could make a difference.
Sherri, would you like to add anything on this?
Well, I do think the G20 can play an important role here. And because we have to be able to integrate across the various parts of our different policies, particularly trade and global economic policy, have to be integrated as a key component of our foreign policy and into our security policies. And the G20 there can play a very, very important role. And that's why the meeting just before the COP was important.
Yeah. There's just one question coming in on the carbon taxing and how China relates to this new agreement between the US and the EU that opens potentially the path forward to a common tax on these specific products. And the question is, well, how can this be addressed? How can the Chinese reactions, potential negative reaction, be addressed in this context? I mean, Connie, maybe you want to take this?
Yeah, I think that it really requires a lot of diplomatic effort also on the Europe side, EU side, to really reach out and have a dialogue on the Chinese on this. I think it's a positive sign that the Biden administration is starting to think along the same lines back home in the United States. One could have feared that we would have a lot of, sort of resistance from the American side to this idea, and that could have soured sort of the better climate relations now during the during the Biden administration. So I think that it's a good sign that US and EU are having sensible discussions about how to do this. And if that could then be transferred also to include at a certain point China in this dialogue, I think it's really, really important. And I think that the good thing is to start with a few significant sectors that actually also in China, in order to reach their internal goals, they also have to start putting a price on things, and they are starting to put a price on things. So I think that if there is a real will also on the American side to have a strong dialogue with China on climate issues, then it could lead to some kind of understanding that it is okay to charge someone who is trying to sort of import something to my country, someone who's not doing their fair share. One should then be very clear that sometimes it could also end up being the Europeans having to pay, or somebody else having to pay. It's not just targeted against China or anybody else, because they are also becoming more resource and energy and climate efficient in whatever they are producing. But I think it would be a really big step forwards in the world if these three entities could sit together and agree on how to do a carbon border adjustment mechanism of some kind.
So before we end, we have just 2 minutes left. So I'd like to just 1 minute each hear from you. From now to COP27, what would you say are like the 1 or 2 main priorities for the US and the EU to work together on as we approach COP27? Sherri, do you want to go first?
Okay, that's a tall order to fit into a small glass because we have so many ambitions on climate over the next year. But I will say that I think the US and Europe, US, EU, and NATO and our allies, we have to be as much in lockstep as possible on our overall climate strategies, because that will strengthen us. And that will strengthen our ability to undertake responsible climate action. I am pleased that we are growing climate literacy across our foreign policy and national security communities. I want to see that continue across the board in the US, in NATO, in the EU, in other organizations. I think that's going to be vitally important to have that climate awareness, that lens. And then I think we could also continue this race to the top in particularly key sectors of the clean energy transformation. When we were just talking about the border tax, obviously decarbonizing sectors like steel and cement, okay, and going, those are key sustainable aviation fuels, electrification, provided it's from clean energy sources, are going to be key to the future. And we need to fire on all of those fronts and continue to hold hands as we hold each other to a continued high standard.
And just very briefly, I think what we must do is to show that we are actually delivering visibly on the pledges that we have given. I think that that would also be what is needed. If, for instance, we were to see in Egypt next year, China pledged to peak their emissions earlier than 2030, that what they have already pledged. And then I would mention financing, not just the public financing, but I really think to make it visible that a lot of private financing is ready to invest also in Africa, also in developing countries, because it is also in our interest to sort of have more resilient societies, to make them focus on adaptation. I mean, they need also the new technologies, but they need that also private investment money is coming their way. And I think we have to prove that. And I think it's quite urgent to be able to do that in real life and not just as an ambition in the future when we get to Egypt next year.
Thank you very much to both of you, Connie, Sherri. Thank you for your time and for your contributions. I am officially late, as usual, but this was so interesting that it's hard to stop. Thank you to my team for putting this together, and to everyone who sent in questions. And see you next month for another Transatlantic Tuesday. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Laura. Bye-bye, Connie.
Bye-bye.